afternoon and welcome to the kickoff presentation of the 2024 spring season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series. Thank you all for coming out. This is a great crowd. We really appreciate it. My name is John Carlton and I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition. As always, I want to give a big thank you to Paul Sawyer Public Library and in particular Public Service Librarian Diane Dehoney for hosting us and co-organizing this series, as well as for all they do for our community. Also, I want to give a big thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for recording these lectures and hosting them on their YouTube channel. As a side note, it's a really great thing to have a nonprofit public service utility that has been part of a great historic tradition in Frankfort dating all the way back to 1804 when Richard Throckmorton laid wooden pipes all the way from Cove Spring to Frankfort and started one of the first public waterworks in the United States. So thank you to the Frankfort Plant Board. And we also want to thank Cable 10, the State Journal, and Cap City Radio for giving us great free publicity and endorsing the lecture series. I'm very excited for today's lecture for several reasons. First, February is, of course, Black History Month, and I'm ecstatic that we're able to help explore and honor the many amazing lives and accomplishments of Frankfort's and Kentucky's Black community. If you don't know, there's kind of a very long overdue renaissance going on of research and preservation activities of Frankfort's Black history. So I want to take a moment to acknowledge some great work that's occurred recently. In the last several years, Franklin County Trust for Historic Preservation was instrumental in saving and rehabilitating the historic Mason's Grocery in South Frankfort, which is now home to the Franklin County Family and Women's Shelter, now called Fresh Start Frankfort, as well as saving and moving to a new location, the First Corinthian Missionary Baptist Church's historic parsonage, also in South Frankfort. In 2022, Frankfort's Focus on Race Relations group, led by the late Ed Poe, his daughter Christy Poe, and others, in partnership with the Equal Justice Initiative, placed a marker at the Singing Bridge, remembering two Black men, John Maxey and Marshall Boston, who were tragically lynched there by white mobs at the turn of the 20th century. Soil was taken from the base of the bridge, and after a large commemorative community ceremony, the soil was sent to Montgomery, Alabama, and was featured in the Equal Justice Initiative's Lynching in America exhibit as part of EJI's Community Remembrance Project. Also in 2022, the City of Frankfort's Planning Department, with a certified local government grant from the National Park Service and the Kentucky Heritage Council, contracted and released the 350-page African American Historic Context Report, the first major project initiated by the very new, at the time, City Historic Preservation Officer Vicki Bierenberg, paving the way for a new understanding of the history of our community and its Black citizens, as well as encouraging us to honor more resources significant to Frankfort's Black community by nominating them to the National Register of Historic Places. And I'm also ecstatic that this kind of extremely important work has led to, as of just last month, Frankfort's newest individually listed National Register of Historic Places property, the Green Hill Missionary Baptist Church. And speaking of Green Hill, there is an incredible project going on at Green Hill Cemetery led by Cemetery Board Chair Jeanette Walker and Board Member Freddie Johnson of Buffalo Trace fame, with help from Buffalo Trace suburban archaeologist Nick Laraquente. Using combinations of various technologies such as ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and drones, they are mapping around 5,000 graves and uncovering a lot of great history in the process. All of this professional work isn't cheap, so I encourage all of you to reach out to Mr. Johnson and Ms. Walker to see how you can help. Another great recent project honoring Frankfort's Black community was Joanna Hay Productions' March on Frankfort project honoring Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 1964 10,000-person civil rights march on the Capitol. That project was produced with funds from the National Park Service's Preserving African American Civil Rights History grant in partnership with PBS Learning Media and the Capital City Museum. And Joanna has yet another ongoing project called Stories from the Balcony, a partnership with the Grand Theater and the Kentucky Oral History Society, with help from interviewer Katima Smith-Willis and project historian Caleb Bush, to document the oral histories of people, Black and white, who have lived through segregation and the height of the civil rights movement in Frankfort. So a big thank you is due to all those great individuals and organizations who are doing such amazing historical and preservation work for our community. Second, as you'll find out today, Frankfort and Franklin County have another woefully untapped resource in its amazing horse history. And as several of you know, I've been eager to begin having these stories told. Since before their founding, Frankfort and Franklin County were horse towns with racetracks and training and breeding operations at Leestown, Holmes Street, Silver Lake, the Forks of Elkhorn, Wood Lake, and more, which produced some of the finest horses of the late pioneer and antebellum era, including, for instance, Nantura and Fanny Holton, who were originally owned and bred by steamboat captain John Alexander Holton. Those horses, under the later ownership of Frank Harper at Nantura Stock Farm in Woodford County, went on to produce the immortal Tinbrook and Longfellow, the first horses in Kentucky to have monuments erected in their honor. And those monuments are still located at the former Nantura Stock Farm property today. Operations such as these were often operated by members of the Black community, the enslaved, the employed, and by free persons of color. They and their families ran the farms that supported these operations. They were breeders, jockeys, caretakers, and much more. And I'm very pleased to have our esteemed guest lecturer today share with you that incredible history. And without further ado, please welcome my partner in crime, Paul Sawyer Public Library's Public Service Librarian, Diane Dehoney, to introduce today's lecturer.
Hello and welcome on behalf of the Paul Sawyer Public Library. As John said, my name is Diane Dehoney. I'm the Community Service Librarian here at Paul Sawyer, and we're thrilled to have such a wonderful crowd out today to hear from our esteemed speaker. So before we start, if you don't mind, if you have your cell phones on you, to turn those on silent or vibrate, we would sure appreciate that. And it is my great honor to introduce Roda Ferraro, director of the Keeneland Library, who pursued her undergraduate studies at Emory University and her graduate studies at Indiana University before her years in teaching and research oversight at Vanderbilt University and the University of Kentucky. She holds a master's degree in library and information science from the University of Kentucky as well. Rhoda has more than 20 years of experience leading, assessing, and promoting library, museum, research, and educational services, including her work with the Keeneland Library and National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame since 2014. Through her focus on creating responsive systems of access for researchers and racing fans around the world, Keeneland Library's research services doubled, or their volume doubled, during Rhoda's tenure as head librarian. Additionally, the library's outreach programs tripled their reach under her management, while her focus on digitizing collections grew the library's digital assets by more than 500% in 6 years. Rhoda's industry educational initiatives include launching research fundamental workshops for university equine students, curating Keeneland Library's physical and virtual exhibits, expanding the Keeneland Library Lecture Series, and piloting the National Museum of Racing and Hall of Fame's 5th and final season of Foal Patrol to an unprecedented global reach of 4 million users in 2022. Rhoda returned to the Keeneland Library in the fall of 2022 to curate the library's newest exhibit, The Heart of the Turf, Racing's Black Pioneers, and today she will be sharing with us about that exhibit. Please welcome Roda Ferraro.
Thank you. I'm short, and I don't know why I feel the need to have this raised, but let's just start off being a little ironic. How's that go? All right, can you hear me okay? Yes. All right, thank you all so much for coming. Today, I was talking to Kim and John Paul Miller, regulars at the Keeneland Library, and speakers at the lecture series in their own right at the library, about the fact that it feels like a very rainy Saturday morning. It's not raining anymore, and it's not Saturday morning. That's probably just a testament to how much I've been up this week in general. So welcome this afternoon. I have been in the role of director of the library for about 6-7 months. But with the library, and I'm on a contract with the National Museum up in Saratoga Springs since 2014. So about 10 years of my career has been focused on information, image, assets that are tied in some way to the thoroughbred industry. And that's what the Keeneland Library does and is. We're the world's largest repository of those information resources, of those image assets, about 5 million image assets alone, documenting everything that you could even dream up of related to the industry. So yes, obviously the horses, but far more frequently we work with folks on research for the people, the places, the historic trends, some of the tougher topics in racing, drugs in racing, equine fatalities. I think you probably can imagine how much contact we have with journalists, historians, economists, worldwide, looking to tap into the resources that we have uniquely at our library. Our biggest challenge is that almost our collection is just so large that it's still very safe to say almost all of our holdings are still in print. Yes, we digitize, but we have so much, and our team is so humble that that is very painstaking, slow work to production scan and production index. We take our most imperiled collections and we do that. A lot of these images that you're going to see today in the slideshow will be the most imperiled images of black horsemen. So that's a very good example of we can't digitize it all, but let's start with the collections that have the most usage historically and that we foresee having the most usage, and those that are most imperiled. Sort of like a 2 to 3 pronged approach for preservation. So you're scanning to create a different form. So now it exists in this digital form that you have to maintain, and it still exists in that print form. And that's okay. We've doubled the places that it lives and the modalities that it lives. But now that it's in this digital form, we don't have to handle that original form as much. All right, so we can just send that digital copy out into the world, and that original negative or that original text from 1725 or that chart book from 1896 isn't handled as much, okay? So we are funded by Keeneland, but work with folks from all over the world. Until you reach a research cap with us, we offer remote research services at no cost to folks. So yes, our library is free and available to use to the public. But it was very important for us in about 2015-16 to stop and think about, unlike a special collections library that may be tied to ongoing, very deliberate university funding, like say a Yale or a Harvard, and those are sort of that's the caliber of materials that we have. We don't have that caliber of funding though, and just infrastructure. So how can we mimic what it is that they do to create systems for 24/7 access to our collections? So our library is free. It doesn't cost anything to come to us to research there. But if you live close by, or if you have funding to take a sabbatical, you're going to be at an advantage. And we didn't want folks to have that advantage. We wanted everybody to have equitable access to our collection. So that's when we began to pilot our remote service delivery. There aren't a lot of libraries that do what we do. So instead of typing that question into Google, and I promise you, if you're calling us, you're not going to find the information online. All right? It's not there. It's in that library somewhere. So just like you type that question into Google, you submit an online request form to us. We don't have it all. Sometimes I know we do have it, but we don't have maybe the 60 hours to find that needle, in the haystack. So it's a slow Google response, essentially. We're trying to mimic that service delivery, how people tap into information. You ask us your question, we dig, we scan on demand. The next time someone has that question for which that information resource or that image resource would be helpful, that scan is there and it's ready for the next person. So we're slowly and responsively building up that capacity, okay? Any questions about the library and what we do? I promise you I'm not going to talk anymore about the library. I just want you to know what resources are available to you if you ever have that need, okay? Any questions at all? Okay, well, let's get into to the meat of why we're all here today. The heart of the turf, racing's Black pioneers. For decades, we have been connecting writers, journalists, filmmakers to information, resources, and images about Black horsemen. And so often, you're going to hear me say Black horsemen. Well, because for a very, very long time, it was just that. It was Black horsemen. And if we're talking about the decades leading to the Civil War, those horsemen would have been enslaved. Following emancipation, free. Sometimes before the Civil War, free. All right, but that was very rare. We'll talk about some examples of that today. It wasn't, if you were an enslaved man or woman in this period of time, it's not to say that it was impossible. We just have yet to find any documentary evidence that a girl or a woman would have been working with livestock in an enslaved capacity. It could be out there. I've excavated slave cabin sites. We're always looking. But so far, we just have not been able to find demonstrable proof that that happened. It was not only was it this forced context of labor, there were very clear gender roles and hierarchies within this forced context of labor. Okay, women had certain roles, men had certain roles. From a very young age, enslaved boys would have been sought out specifically to work with livestock, all right? And the best of the best would have been sought out to work with thoroughbreds, all right, within the stock more generally. Again, we'll talk about, where's my clicker? Here it is. We'll talk more about kind of this unparalleled, multi-generational, can you still hear me if I step away from the mic? Is it okay? Oh, but the camera can't. All right, I'm gonna have to be still for once. Okay, I'll try my best. So, multi-generational horsemanship skills that are, oh gosh, I'm reluctant to use the word cultivated if we're talking about cultivating something in a context of enslavement. But I do want to use that word because I want to connote the degree to which this was a skilled art, craft, science, and the knowledge, the practical daily applications would have been passed from one generation of the enslaved working in that capacity to the next. All right, in every way, from stable boy to groom to exercise rider to jockey to trainer to foreman of a stable. You didn't call up a vet if your horse had an abscess. Each farm would have had really proprietary ways to kind of take care of the horse's health as well. All of this knowledge, for the most part, in the South would have been in the hands and minds of these enslaved boys and men. So, although not related by blood in the context of these farms, there was definitely this multi-generational theme. And I really want to stress that. So just before we begin to talk about some stories specifically, I wanted to lay that foundation because it's the passing on of this knowledge that really set these boys and men to later apply what they had in a free context, post-war, in a way that was really marketable and unmatched, all right? Unmatched in skill. And we'll get there with some really, to me, larger than life examples, okay? But before we start talking about people, I want to set some just physical kind of contextual foundation too. John had talked about some of the racing options that would have been available here locally. I'm going to focus on one in particular that was in Lexington's East End, the Kentucky Association track, which is photographed here. This photograph was taken at least 20 to 30 years post-war, but I like to include it just because it's such an active scene. It also just gives, I think, a really nice visual depiction of how just kind of pioneering that this track was for the time, all right? These facilities would have been considered to be ever so fancy, all right, for this era. But the Kentucky Association track that stood in what is now Lexington's East End was founded as an association of men that came together, white men that came together who owned horses, business leaders, a lot were also politicians, but a lot had been members of the Lexington Jockey Club, which was founded in 1797. These men now in 1826 form what is purported to be the oldest turf organization that is associated and incorporated in North America. All right, and this is happening right in Lexington's East End. By 1828, they were racing there. They first purchased 30 acres of land between 5th and 7th Street, just north of Winchester Road. All right, do you all have a sense of where that is in Lexington today? Very much Lexington's East End, like where the Jif plant is. If you've gone to the Jif plant, you've gone a little too far. Come back in, closer to the Lyric Theater, very much where Isaac Murphy Memorial Art Garden is, all right? Because his mansion had a rooftop observatory that overlooked that track, okay? At its height, this track was 65 acres. This track was considered to be a pioneering racing facility with its stables, with its barns. It was only the second mile-long oval on the dirt in North America. And while this track is growing, remember, like larger tracks like Latonia and Churchill in Kentucky, they weren't even a dream yet. All right, so when this track comes on the scene, it's unparalleled in terms of its market share. And even its market share is completely captive, all right, because racing was the country's pastime. This is what you did. White, black, enslaved black, free black, rich, poor, really wasn't much of a middle class at this point. This is what folks did. And it's amazing to me that in the context of slavery and in this era, the decades that this track was operating before emancipation, that we have some pictorial and documentary evidence that on any given race day, there were not segregated sections of this track. Yes, there would be enslaved people coming to watch the races. There would be several enslaved people riding the horses, training the horses, and staffing that track and representing the stables on the grounds as farm workers. But it wasn't until we get closer to the 20th century that we start to see segregated spaces at this track. Not a lot of other examples that I'm aware of in Southern history where you had a mixing of the races during enslavement in that way. All right, and this was so popular that on any given morning of a week leading up to a big stakes race, more people than lived in the town of Lexington would show up at that track just to watch the horses working out. All right, I mean, it was a big deal. So while this track is doing its thing, virtually untouched, no competition from other tracks, the farms that surround this track, Fayette County, Woodford, here, Bourbon, the bluegrass farms, the closer we get to the Civil War, the more and more those farms are focusing on breeding thoroughbreds specifically, if stock was their emphasis. Why did they do that? Why were they focusing on thoroughbreds? I'm asking. Go for it. There's no wrong answer because there would have been many, variables and kind of factors that came into their decision making. Well, the bluegrass started to really put its name on the map as being able to breed the horse and the thoroughbred specifically. The demand for that thoroughbred was rising, and like anyone else, making decisions about what they're going to farm, what they're going to produce, what they're going to sell, it was driven by the market, driven by demand. So we have very quickly, within a 20 to 30 year period, some of the best racehorses in the world being bred here in the bluegrass. They've got an unparalleled track to showcase the very, very best, so extremely competitive fields on any given race day. And you have just, sort of this perfect storm of everything working just great if you're a breeder or an owner of a racing stable, okay? But the labor all of the folks who worked with the horses, again, from that stable boy to the foreman, would have been enslaved. I said I'd give an example of a few people who were providing this work while free. And in this painting here, the man that you see in the top hat on the left, that's Harry Lewis. Harry Lewis was a free man by 1850. He started off riding and then trained. And when we see these rare exceptions of these boys or men that were able to either earn their freedom by buying it, sometimes with purse money won in a race, or win it in a bet. For every one or two examples of those, there are thousands of others where that simply wasn't the case. All right, it really, despite the fact that sometimes these young men and boys even, 14, 15 years old, may have more cash in hand at that given moment than their white owner, based on what they were able to make in the saddle. But they didn't have an owner willing to let them go, all right? That cash in hand offer was not worth to them what that person would go on to produce for them over the course of a lifetime, all right? And like I said before, Harry Lewis is a very good example, and actually the next 4 or 5 people that follow are very good examples of starting off at about 6 or 7 years old, mucking stalls, and wherever the horses were, where these boys would be. Okay, so if the horses were turned out at night, that's where you'd be. You were 24/7 eyes on that horse. Number one concern was the security of that animal. And other than you, it was the most costly, valuable stock on that land. Okay? Eyes on that horse. Something off with the eating, water intake. Something off with the gait, behavioral, temperamental. So from a very young age, these boys would acclimate to what it would take to work with that horse every moment of every day. All right, now and they would have been called stable boys. All right, and for the most part, that's still what folks are called today that start off that, really young, in their late teens, maybe as a summer job in high school. And a lot of these young men would stay in that role, but it would progress through time. They would work their way up the ranks to, say, a groom, all right, a senior groom. So in their entire life, enslaved and working with horses, they were in a caretaker role, okay? And that would have been the vast majority of people. Now, in the case of Harry Lewis and hundreds of others, from a young age, some of these stable boys would have been put on the back of a horse just to train on that farm. Not a lot of training tracks like we have today. A lot of the training happened right there in your locality, right there on your acreage. So 8 or 9, maybe you've been on a horse, maybe you haven't, but you've been around one, and you're here and you're standing, so we need you, get on the back of that horse. And that would have been under the guidance of an enslaved black trainer who was conditioning that horse. So about 8 or 9, you start to see some of these boys working into the role of what we would call an exercise rider today. All right, so yes, they're riding those horses, but just around the farm. They are not an official jockey in a race. By about 9 or 10, some of the best, or again, maybe just sometimes a quote-unquote warm body, which I'm actually quoting from documentary evidence there, in a pinch was put on a horse in a horse race because they were there and there was no other rider. All right, so maybe you've ridden around the farm a few times, but it's a very different story to ride in a horse race. All right, why so young? Why were they so young? And actually, you see child riders through the 1930s in the United States, regardless of race, until labor laws kind of shut that down. Why were jockeys chosen so young? For weight, all right? The smaller you are, the younger you are, rather, the more likely you are to make weight. And, you know, it doesn't take much to get beyond that 100 to maybe 110 pounds of making weight, even as a 13 or 14-year-old. So you may have had a lot of aptitude, but you're growing more quickly, maybe than some of your other peers. And some just truly horrific things would have happened to enforce that weight to be maintained. All right. Of course, I think it goes without saying, just starving, heat boxes, sweat boxes, being buried in manure pits to kind of sweat off that weight. This is something that we see in that period of time from free jockeys as well, at least the malnutrition piece and the chronic underhydrating piece. But we certainly don't see free black or white jockeys of the time, locking themselves into sweat boxes. But these young boys would have had to have endured that, okay? And some of them, it's hard to know because we don't have a lot of first-person accounts. But from the few first-person accounts that we do have, this was considered to be a way to potentially gain a place, all right? You might be able to make some cash. It doesn't mean that your cash would be worth anything, but it could be. Maybe you catch that owner on that day where one business transaction's gone sour. Gosh, here's $50,000 in cash. I might take that. I mean, seeing that that's what my farm makes in 5 years, if I've had a very, very good 5 years and I'm the biggest and the best. This is the degree of money we're talking about in some of these instances, okay? So, I'm using Harry Lewis as just illustrative of that, but Harry Lewis was free by 1850. Something else that was really pivotal to the industry and really the basis of the economy that we have here in Kentucky today is what also happened in 1850. There was a colt that was later named Darley Fold in 1850. All right, he was reportedly bred by Dr. Warfield, although at this point, Harry Lewis had been working for Warfield for quite some time, previously enslaved and then later as a free man. So I think it's safe to say, Kim, I don't know your thoughts on this, Harry Lewis likely had a lot of decision-making in which stallions were covering which mares at this period of time. So Darley, and this is the entry. It is so hard for me not to go over and walk over to that and show you things on that screen. Can I take the microphone? Okay. Okay, so Darley. Colts and fillies are rarely named at birth, but when they're finally given a name, this entry, all of the produce of Alice Carneiro, so there's the dam, there's all of her produce. It appears maybe just to be like any other colt or filly, right? But when this bay colt was given a name, it was Darley. We see that he was by Boston. If you can make this out, we also see that in pencil, somebody wrote in after the fact, afterward named Lexington. Can you all make that out? You also see that it was sold to Viley in Ten Brock for $2,500. This refers to Willa Viley and Richard Ten Brock. Harry Lewis trained Lexington, or the horse that would later become Lexington, in his 3-year-old season when Viley and Ten Brock and others bought him. At that time, Harry Lewis had also leased the racing rights off of Dr. Warfield. Willa Viley had previously owned the man Harry Lewis. Now he's in this position to acquire the racing rights off of a man that had previously been his slave. Again, you don't see a lot of stories in other industries like this, where you have former enslaved men within 6 to 12 months brokering business deals with their former owners. So we can thank Harry Lewis for training that colt, putting him on the radar as a 2-year-old, and I won't go into the awful long legal battle where he did, in fact, he lost those racing rights to the horse. But Ten Brock goes on and champions this horse who goes on to become Lexington, okay? The most influential sire of the late 1800s, and really just completely a foundational sire for the breed North America, period. So I think that this Harry Lewis's story is just one of many that, to me, is just so very poignant in terms of its reach, in terms of the power that this man had, that he carved for himself in this context that's 15 years before slavery is abolished. And I did intentionally choose this blue version of Lexington, although I have to be honest, sometimes it makes me cringe a little bit. I'm not going to tell the Fayette County Chamber of Commerce that, but yeah, here's Big Blue. And we could thank a host of folks, but certainly Harry Lewis is one of those folks that we need to thank for that legacy. Ansel Williamson, another example of a black horseman who spent much of his life enslaved, would have started off in the same capacity as everybody else, stable boy, and he rode, and he trained, and then he went on to be a foreman. Once he made his way to Kentucky, he had a successive string of owners, big-time prominent breeders and racers in the bluegrass, okay? A. Keene Richards, Robert Alexander at Woodburn Stud. But it's safe to say that at some point in their life, most of the prolific runners of the time would have been under the influence at some point in their lives, whether it was through breeding or that early conditioning, or training in their 2- and 3-year-old seasons with Ansel Williamson. But some of the greats that he trained were Asteroid and Norfolk, and later he'd go on to train the very first Kentucky Derby winner. But when he did that, Aristides, he was a free man, because it's now 1875. Williamson, like Lewis, but especially Williamson, I think, in terms of what we have in the record to kind of back this up, he set a trend of mentoring and passing down information. And in his case, he spent the majority of his life working with horses enslaved, whereas the generation that followed him spent the majority of their life working with horses as free men. He was right at that cusp where the latter years of his life, he was able to do what he did so well and operate in a free market as a free person. But the 2 and 3 generations that he mentored and trained in all of those decades, his role as foreman or senior trainer at multiple farms, definitely laid a foundation in Fayette County and surrounding counties that really doesn't have a corollary in any other geographic region. All right, because that model that was set was a model that stayed in place. Okay, so we have, for example, one of the young men that he mentored was Ed Brown. Ed Brown, in this painting with Ansel Williamson, is here. He's still young, he's still enslaved, he's a jockey. At the age of 7, he was sold to R.A. Alexander on Lexington's slave auction block, separated from his family, with a mind to put him to work as a stable boy. At 9, he was riding. By about 9.5, 10, he was a jockey. Anytime he got on a horse, you know, the competition knew that there was going to be trouble. So much so that the fields would even be really small because folks thought, why would I really enter a horse in this race if Brown's going to be on that horse? Ed Brown and Ansel Williamson in the latter part of the 1800s would set up shop just within blocks of each other in Lexington's East End after the Civil War. And the knowledge that Ed had acquired from Ansel, he passed down just like other folks of his age. The Eli Jordans, the Lee Christies, the Colston brothers. You see in census records ample examples, okay, of formal apprenticeships taking place in homes
that were built around the Kentucky Association track after the Civil War by African Americans very intentionally to be close to that track, to be able to, without having land, form and sustain and grow very successful racing and breeding operations. They didn't need the land because they were a block away from the track and the training facility, all right, and the year-round boarding options. Yes, they boarded and trained at surrounding farms as well, but the vicinity of that track was a huge draw after the Civil War. So much so that within the first 10 years after the Civil War, the population around that track more than doubled, and it was almost entirely African Americans recently freed, and their families. And this is where they chose to take what it is that they knew was a valuable asset. They knew that what they had and the skill they had was valuable, because when they were owned themselves, they saw how much folks were willing to pay for their services. So, well, if they were willing to pay that for me when I was a slave, I'm sure I probably could broker some serious contracts here, and they did. All right, and within 5 years, you start to see the Ed Browns, the Ansel Williamsons, and 4 or 5 families apprenticing the next generation within their homes, all there right in Lexington's East End. All right, there were not 10 or 20 prominent black horse owners and trainers and riders in Lexington's East End. There were hundreds, okay, and that spilled over into surrounding counties as well. Within 3 blocks of that track, 4 future racing Hall of Famers lived and raised their families, and most are buried in African Cemetery number 2. I'm not aware of another sport that has anything like that, okay? So this, and because of the wealth that the track and that the breeding were able to bring into these homes, while the men were away traveling the racing circuit, they traveled the racing circuit then just like you have to today. All right, you go wherever racing is. Nobody's racing year round. You're breeding year round, and you're raising, you're taking care of your horses, but you're not racing year round. So while the men were away, you have some really unique examples of in the early 1870s, their sisters, their mothers, their wives were back home here buying real estate, investing in other businesses, running the business, training the next generation of kids. Again, not a lot of other examples of a southern town comparably sized in 1872 where a lot of, if not all, of your real estate transactions in a 6-month period were conducted by African American women. That's the kind of wealth that we had there. Now, did everybody make it big? No. But everybody was drawn to the possibility of making it big. And where did you make it the biggest? Like Ed Brown. First riding as an enslaved boy, then training, owning, breeding, pin hooking. That was the potential to make the money, all right? So riding, training, and owning, the most visible and the most lucrative roles. And for about 40 years after the Civil War, those most visible, headlining, money-making roles were dominated by these men living in the bluegrass. You see in a lot of the apprentices that the hope that I've got to ride when I'm young enough to make that seed money so that I can go on and do what my mentor has done. All right, without that seed money, I might never progress to that state. So, just like you would expect, a fraction of people grew to that degree of success in terms of name recognition and in terms of their personal assets. Okay, but everyone else was just working. But because of this steady work, the year-round work, we see the emergence of a black middle class here before you start to see it in other southern towns. All right, all driven by the work in this industry. So you have stables that grew so large that they were employing, 40 or 50 men, boys, all black. This is the McClellan stable. And then, we have this context brewing there that sets us up for some serious kind of superstar stories, like Oliver Lewis. Okay, so Oliver Lewis, at this point, he was born in Woodford County, but which we always thought he was born in Fayette County, but just in the past 9 months, we've now discovered he was in fact born in Woodford County. And we love that. We love when we find mistakes because that means we're learning and we're growing. So 1875, very first Kentucky Derby. The Kentucky Derby then was just one derby, all right, just like a host of others all across the country. It was, they were trying to create something there at Churchill that was competitive, prestigious, with a nice purse to draw a really good field. But there were a lot of other derbies, all right? It did not have the esteem that it has today. That said, it was a fiercely local derby in Kentucky. There were 15 horses in the field that day, and 13 of the 15 horses were ridden by black jockeys. Again, I think that was just the norm. I think that speaks to the dominance that we're talking about here. And Oliver Lewis won. He won on Aristides, who was trained by Ansel Williamson and owned by McGrath, who is white and really quite a character. We won't go into McGrath's story, but if you ever want to know and you ever want to kind of feel like you're entering soap opera territory, we can talk about McGrath. Oliver Lewis's whole family, for the most part, and I do truly mean whole family, father, grandfather, great uncles, brothers, worked with horses. And we've got Oliver Lewis Way in Lexington. 16 of the first 28 Derby winners were ridden by black jockeys. Oliver Lewis was the very first. Billy Walker, who was born enslaved but was so very young at emancipation, he doesn't really recall that life at all. He would be one of those other Kentucky Derby winners. He won the third running in 1877. Billy Walker set records at Churchill that weren't broken for 50 to 60 years. He also was the title holding jockey at that track for several years. And of all the places that he rode, and he won his first race when he was 11 years old in New York, so he rode a lot of tracks. I think he's most associated with Churchill. It's just sort of being a fixture there, and at the KA track in Lexington as well. Billy Walker was young enough in terms of what was happening at the time politically and historically in our country, right? So he was riding in the Reconstruction era, basically. And, you know, he rode for 20 years. And weight, health, that pushed him out of the saddle more so than the systemic mounting discrimination and violence that we see the closer we get to 1900, targeting black jockeys. So what did he do after that? It was his entire life. It was all he knew. He was a good mentor to Isaac Murphy, his friend and neighbor. He became what we would call a bloodstock agent or a pedigree analyst today. And he went on to be paid by the likes of John Madden to make decisions about which stallions and which mares to pair together. And in all those years that John Madden out at Hamburg Place made the North American record books for top North American breeder, this was who he was paying to make all these decisions about breeding. It was Billy Walker. Billy Walker also rode under a pen name, and he was kind of like a turf rider for a little bit too. He wasn't that much older than Isaac Murphy, but he was his mentor and then later his friend. Isaac Murphy was born in Bourbon County. I'm not sure that there's much I can say about Isaac Murphy that hasn't been said. So was he a stellar athlete? Yes. Has anyone come close to his winning percentage ever that he sustained over his entire career? No. Conservative estimates were about 43% of the time he got on a horse, he won. That's really unbelievable. All right, the only people that ever approached that would have been black jockeys of this era, but they did that maybe in a season or two. 39%, 40% for one season or two. That was 43% winning percentage over his entire career. About 3/4 of the time he got on a horse, he finished in the money. I mentioned earlier that he had a couple residences, but his primary residence was the foundation of that sat on what is now the Isaac Murphy Memorial Art Garden on 3rd and Nelson in Lexington. As you're heading down Winchester Road before it splits and you get to Jiff, take a look at that park. If you're looking at that little park on your left as you leave Lexington toward Winchester, That park is there to commemorate him, and that's where his primary residence stood. He and his wife Lucy had no children, all right, but they were pillars of the community, very philanthropic. They'd host baptisms, wakes, weddings, and, you know, I think what seemed to be some pretty fun and lavish parties up on that roof overlooking that track. I had said that there were several derbies in America at the time. This painting commemorates the very first running of the American Derby, which was a big race up in Chicago. The very first running of the Derby, finishers in 1, 2, and 3 were all ridden by black jockeys. Isaac Murphy won that day. He would go on to win 4 of the first 5 runnings of the American Derby, the most prestigious high-stakes race in the country at that time. To speak about some of the potential to earn that I've referenced more than once, here's Isaac Murphy up at what they called the Salvatore Clam Bake. It was a celebration. They had a clam bake for the horse Salvatore. It was really, I think, probably more for the horse than Murphy. That's why it's called the Salvatore Clam Bake and not the Murphy Clam Bake. But the fact that he was present and surrounded by about 60 other white male socialites. God, I almost said socialists. Socialites. Well, I think it's just telling in its own right. I think this photograph also captures a lot in terms of his poise, his confidence. In one season, with one client, Isaac Murphy secured a $10,000 contract. All right, that was for Lucky Baldwin, another really unsavory character who made his money out west, supposedly in mining and real estate, but I'm not sure we'll ever really know. Lucky Baldwin had multiple attempts on his life, including from women. And there was a woman that shot him, and he survived all of these attempts. And on the witness stand, she did say that it was her Christian duty to remove this man from the planet Earth. So Lucky Baldwin was big. He liked to throw his money around. He liked to just kind of make these big statements. That said, he was wise about how he threw his money around. All right, so $10,000. And what that contract was for was that if Lucky Baldwin had a horse in a race on a day where Murphy was there, Murphy would ride his horse before he would ride anyone else's. So it didn't even matter the outcome of the race. So one client, Isaac Murphy, one season, $10,000. That was in a year where the top 1% of Americans made $1,000 a year. So that kind of money was astronomical, okay? You can see why there might have been an appeal to make it big, all right? And even if you don't make it that big, even if you are operating at, 1/25th of the capacity of Isaac Murphy, you're still more wealthy than the top 1% Americans as a jockey at this time. Do you all have any questions for me? Yes?
How long did he live, and was he successful to the end?
We won't know whether or not he started to dabble in training. He died very young. He wasn't even quite 36. And Lexington threw a funeral for him like the town had never seen. The official cause of death was pneumonia. And there have been a lot of theories over time, maybe poisoning, maybe even at that clam bake that we had seen the picture of before. Catherine Mooney, who's a historian at Florida State, and I feel that, and others, feel that most likely what happened there was that he did die of pneumonia, but it was an opportunistic infection, so he was what he would have called flipping, or forcing himself to vomit to make weight, aspirated, and then, just all those years of being chronically underfed, malnourished, would have, had taken its toll on his immune system too. So likely an opportunistic infection from aspiration. That's, I think, where a lot of folks land now. But still, on paper, official cause of death, pneumonia. He did start to dabble in training again. We don't know what that could have looked like. There aren't a lot of artifacts that have survived and that are known to be in public repositories like ours, like museums or libraries of these black horsemen of this era that you can come and see and put your hands on. There really aren't a lot more in private collections than are in public collections. But we do have a little Victorian cake tray at the Keeneland Library that Isaac and his wife Lucy would have used as their calling card tray at their East End home. So if you ever want to see something that he would have used every day, just feel free to stop by and we can bring that up for you, okay? Yes?
Your talk is full of vignettes about these people in the horse industry. I'm sure it's not all written down in an orderly way. How is this just years of research where you picked up all this?
Yes.
How is this all?
A long time. A lot of research, a lot of writing, and a lot of that's been driven by our researchers, our patrons. It's very rare that in our team that we have the time to focus our research on things that we'd like to focus on. So this is a rare moment for me where this aligns very closely with my research interest over my entire career. And I've been fortunate enough to be able to delve into it in a way that I can't necessarily with everything. Our volume is just so high, and we're researching everything for everyone else. We have no time to kind of dig into some of these stories. This is a rare example when I can, and I'm so very grateful. Yes?
In your credentials, we read in introductions that you had worked up at the Hall of Fame, the Saratoga.
Uh-huh.
I'm just curious, and I know every year they bring new inductees in.
Uh-huh.
What is the percentage of these African-American superstars that are in that Hall of Fame? Because quite frankly, it seems like every time I see it, they're all Caucasian.
Yes. You'd see Caucasian, especially like mid-20th century. You'll see a lot more Latino as we progress to today. When the Hall of Fame in 1955, when they were established, inducted its first class, Isaac Murphy was the first athlete inducted in the Hall of Fame. Jimmy Wingfield's in the Hall of Fame. Actually, a lot of the folks that we're talking about today are. Ansel Williamson, Ed Brown. Yes?
So when was the end of your lifetime?
We'll get there. We're getting kind of close. The closer we creep to 1900, the more and more we see deliberate, systemic attempts to push black boys and men, and they still very much would have been boys, although free. At this point in time, we're talking about 13 or 14-year-olds that were riding and had a tremendous earning capacity. You can imagine what that might do to someone when you've got a large family to support and you're 14 years old.
I know the heart of the horse racing, at least the breeding industry, was kind of swung like a pendulum between the Northeast tracks and the bluegrass area. During emancipation, where was the pendulum swinging at that time, and what role did emancipation play in perhaps drawing it back to the center of the bluegrass, as the heart of that industry?
Yeah, there were other pockets of racing down in Louisiana, certainly up in the Northeast, New York in particular, and you start to even see folks dabbling in it on the West Coast, but not to the extent and with the assets and the backing that you see up in the Northeast. That said, this was still considered to be the breeding in particular and racing capital of the world. That kind of never left. Remind me to talk about anti-gambling legislation at the turn of the 20th century, because that was another massive political, economic, historic shift that coincided with the timing of Jim Crow era really digging in and kind of having taken hold. So there were two kind of large things happening at the same time, right around the turn of the 20th century. But at this point, like post-war, yes, there was a lot of talk about Virginia breds versus Kentucky breds, New York breds versus, southern horses bred in southern states. But if you just go back and you look at purse structures, if you go back and look at top breeders, top runners, top performers, time after time, you're going to see the bluegrass kind of lighten up those charts. Okay? All right. Shelby Pike Barnes, maybe a name that a lot of folks don't know, but Shelby Pike Barnes was born in Beaver Dam, Kentucky. In 1888 and 1889, he was the most winning, we call it the winningest jockey in North America. In 1888, he was the very first jockey to surpass 200 career wins in a season. That was a big deal because they didn't race as much as they do today. Tony Hamilton, this speaks to your point about some of those tracks and some of the presence up north. Tony Hamilton had a really solid run at New York tracks in particular. But when he had his wedding reception was in the home of Isaac Murphy, his friend. So rode very heavily in New York. All these folks in the racing circuit and in that racing calendar year found a way back to the bluegrass. Okay, it's really where a lot of their support structures, their networks, and certainly their families were. Okay, now in this period of time, I'm just speaking from my thoughts and opinions here. Okay, I would think that you've got to start feeling a little uncomfortable if you're Anthony Hamilton or Isaac Murphy or Shelby Pike Barnes, where you're making headlines and you're a young black man and no other young black men are really making headlines the way that you are. And folks aren't really talking about things like, they're focused on your skill in the saddle. Occasionally there's a comment in the news about aptitude and about character. But for many years, the news coverage of these young men was more favorable, I think, than most people would think. And certainly unlike anything else that you were reading about peers at the time, okay? And I would think that they would start to feel, the closer we get to 1900, that maybe their days are numbered in this world, in this arena, in this headline-making, money-making venture, because they're second-class citizens everywhere else, but they're the heroes of the track. How long is the white establishment going to sustain that, right? Again, I'm not quoting anything here I've seen in documentation. This is just what I would think, okay? And I think at this point, once we get to about the early 1890s, they're really starting to feel some heat. All right, all of a sudden, you go to your local racing jurisdiction to get your jockey license. It's like, oh, we're not granting as many this year. Okay, well, that's weird because they're granting it over there in that state. That happens to be a state that doesn't have segregation laws on the books. But also, even in New York, it's 1896, 97. I've been getting my jockey license in this state for years. What's the problem? So it wasn't just in the southern states, okay? But once the southern states, and Kentucky in particular, since we focus so much of this on Kentucky, I want to stay there. In 1896, in the Supreme Court ruling Plessy versus Ferguson, that all the southern states with segregation laws on the books, that the Supreme Court deemed those constitutional. That was probably the biggest legal moment that was just, I think, kind of the final straw. So I think you might have felt like you were in this bubble, and it was growing, and it was growing, and at some point it was going to just burst. Well, when the Supreme Court of your country says that segregation laws are constitutional, I think at that point you're doing more than just seeing the writing on the wall, okay? You now have, you have a law, and you have laws, and laws are things that we consider to be good and helpful for our society, right? So if the law is in place, then it must be justifying the sentiment. So we start to see a lot of these folks ride overseas, okay? They're still young, they don't have the opportunity that they had in America anymore. There's more violence on the track. White riders would intentionally ride black jockeys into the rail. There'd be incidents in the jock quarters before and after, even incidents in the town where they may be staying if they were traveling the racing circuit. Less incidents here in Kentucky than when they were traveling, but they had a bigger support network here in Kentucky. Shelby Pike Barnes was really only rode for a few years, likely because of this mounting discrimination and difficulty getting mounts. But Shelby Pike Barnes was 15 when he won his first Kentucky Derby. Father, grandfather, uncles, brothers, all in the horse business. And if you ever see, did I say Shelby Pike Barnes? I'm so sorry. This is Sue Perkins, James Sue Perkins. This is Shelby Pike Barnes. And then we only have one. We have this painting, and we have one known surviving photograph of Barnes, and it's at the library. Sue Perkins, James Sue Perkins. You'll see Sue Perkins Alley in Lexington, or Perkins Lane. That's all the Perkins family. Very prominent horseman. But again, he just sort of had a very meteoric rise and a small taste of what might have been. But with growing discrimination, growing violence, a lot of folks stayed off the track, especially as jockeys. All right, they were able to get licensure and do what they did a little bit longer as trainers and owners, but really beyond 1910, you don't see much of that either. I said that Sue Perkins was 15 when he won his Derby, so was Lonnie Clayton. Lonnie Clayton actually did it before Sue. So Lonnie was the youngest rider to win the Kentucky Derby when he won at 15. Lonnie set records, especially in New York too, that held for decades. Willie Sims, is this a name that you'd recognize? Willie Sims was the only African-American jockey to win what is now every leg of the Triple Crown. Okay, in his case, some of the legs he won more than once. Willie Sims was top rider year in, year out at specific meets and also across the country. And some of his most prominent clients would no longer he couldn't secure contracts with them. So like many others of his age, maybe about 15 to 20, riding, and even some trainers and owners that were black, they took a shot at racing overseas. Willie Sims, in his case, that was a really good choice for him. He met immediate and tremendous success in Europe. And actually the way he rode for a long time, only the past maybe 10 to 20 years, so they kind of stopped calling it that, but they called it the Sims, or the American method of riding. He was just like kind of really high in the stirrup, and they just thought that was so strange looking, thinking how could he possibly win? And then he'd come in and blow him away, and then all of a sudden, all of Europe starts to ride with the Sims method. They're like, but it looks so odd. We want to be more upright on our horse. But Sims was getting it done, and everybody else is getting a little lower in the saddle and a little higher in the stirrup after Sims in Europe. Jimmy Winkfield, born in Charlesburg, Kentucky, one of 17 kids. Winkfield wins back-to-back Kentucky Derbies in 1901, 1902. By mid-1903, he can't get a mount anywhere in this country. He goes overseas. He first rides in Poland, Austria, Germany. He then goes to Russia. The Tsar in Russia loves racing. The Tsar in Russia loves Jimmy Winkfield. He kind of sort of gave him a wife, but Jimmy Winkfield had a family in the States. Jimmy Winkfield later had a family in Russia, and then later Jimmy Winkfield had a family in France. So of the American family of Winkfields, Jimmy's daughter, Lillian Casey, is still alive today. She's 99, and she lives in northern Kentucky. Her daughter, Jimmy's granddaughter, Dr. Amy Casey, is a horse vet who regularly brings her clients to the Keeneland sales. So Jimmy Winkfield's American granddaughter, horse vet, an amazing, amazing person in her own right. Does anybody know the story of Jimmy Winkfield in Russia? Or Jimmy Winkfield leaving Russia? So he's left one country because of discrimination, and he's definitely right up there with all the nobility, okay? In court, that kind of life. And then the Russian Revolution happens. So at that point, Jimmy Winkfield took a string of horses, between about 150 and 200 horses, some horse trainers and their families, some Polish nobility and their families, and they left Russia by foot, fleeing for their lives. And they walked, all those people and horses walked 1,000 miles And there are a couple mountain chains between Russia and Poland, but they walked to Poland. And Jimmy Wingfield was really kind of at the helm of that. So he was already a celebrated athlete in Poland before that. And when he arrived at that point, he really was a national hero in Poland. This painting was commissioned to capture Wingfield specifically. One of the first examples in equine art where the folks paying the artist didn't particularly care about the horse, all right? It was always about the horse and the horse's conformation in equine art. Whoever was in the saddle, it didn't really matter. It was almost like an accessory. And if you look at some of these old paintings and think, God, every jockey looks exactly alike, it's because no one really cared. They were being paid to capture the horse. But for one of the first examples that we know of in equine art where the artist is captured to pay the likeness of the man in the saddle. And the artist's name was Wojciech Kosak. He was the leading Polish portrait artist of the time. And that's who the country commissioned to paint this. This was on loan to us last year, this painting, and it's now back in its original home at the Kentucky Horse Park at the International Museum of the Horse. We restored it as a thank you for them loaning it to us. So now you can see it in a very structurally sound and frame and cleaned up canvas, okay? So speaking to the question, when did it kind of all, quote unquote, fall apart? We get that question a lot. When did it all fall apart? Well, I kind of like to think it must have felt like you were just teetering on the edge all the time and had been for a long, long time. But this shot versus this shot, all right, so I want to do these two shots side by side. 1891, just a random day where a photographer in New York went out to take a picture of the jock quarters that day. And having your photo taken in 1891 wasn't a very common thing to do. It still would have been a little uncomfortable for folks, even jockeys, because it was just new. This photographer was the very first turf photographer that was hired by a track to do what he did. So having someone walking around with a camera at the track was a new thing. I don't really feel like any people in this photo look like they're particularly uncomfortable. That's just me reading body language and clues. 40% of the jockeys, again in this random shot, are black. You see Snapper Garrison's hand on Isaac Murphy's shoulder. They were fierce rivals, but there must have been enough respect to extend that hand there, completely voluntarily. Willie Sims here on Maddox's shoulder. But there's integration here, everybody's touching. This is not a team, these are fierce rivals, but I feel that there's a sense of camaraderie in this shot. I don't know, how do you all feel about that? Do you agree? 17 years later, same track, same photographer, 1908. This is the picture. We have one black jockey in the shot, and he's the only person not touching anyone else. And everyone else has some form of body contact. That's Jimmy Lee. Jimmy Lee truly was the very last black jockey to compete at the level that he did. The shot was taken in 1908. He had just won the Kentucky Oaks in 1907. He goes on to win the Travers Stakes in 1908. So he's not just still riding remarkably when most other black jockeys have been pushed out of the saddle entirely, even at minor racing or at small tracks for 5 to 10 years easily. I don't know how Jimmy Lee was doing what he was doing, but he did. And one day in 1907, Jimmy Lee swept the entire card at Churchill Downs. So every race run at Churchill that day, Jimmy Lee rode the winner. That's never happened since. Jimmy Lee also set track records at Churchill, some that have never been broken to this day. He also set records at the Kentucky Association track, plenty, but that track closed in 33. Churchill's still operating, 1933. Okay, so Jimmy Lee truly is it. And what you see in this shot actually is a very good example of kind of what came next. So it's 1908. We are more than 10 years after Plessy versus Ferguson. We now have that Kentucky Association track, Churchill, tracks that were never segregated, have now for more than a decade had segregated sections in their stands. Incidentally, in 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson, there was one Supreme Court Justice abstention. Do you know who that was?
Harlan.
Yes, and his half-brother? Robert Harlan, a black horseman. So, same father, different mother. For a long time, that relationship was a cousin, half cousins, half or a nephew, but in the past 5 to 10 years, most historians have landed firmly on the fact that they were half brothers. Okay, and as you know, Marshall, the great dissenter, considered to have really radical views on race. He shared tutors and a roof with Robert Harlan, who would go on to be a black horseman. And one of the first, Richard Ten Brock, one of the first Americans to take horses to the U.S. Robert Harlan was the first black man to take horses to the U.S. Very involved in the Republican Party in Kentucky and Ohio. Harlan was, Robert Harlan, that is. Okay, so Jim Crow era at this point, 1908, we're years into it. It doesn't just have a small hold, it is just a way of life, completely encompassing, completely suffocating. At the turn of the century, we also have, which I promised I'd get back to, anti-gambling legislation. And this whole vice movement that swept the country, you can't gamble, you can't drink. So we, within the first 5 years of this lobbying, the anti-gambling lobbying in states across the country, 3/4 of the tracks in the US closed and never reopened. All right, in this period of time, the early 1900s, Kentucky and Maryland were the only states east of the Mississippi where you could still legally bet on a racehorse. So what happened in the first 10 to 15 years? In New York was another major outlet completely shut down by the anti-gambling legislation. So what you have is not as much racing, which means you don't have as much breeding, which means you don't have as many horses, which means you don't have as many jobs. So jobs were scarce for the first time in this industry that anyone could even remember, all right? And, you have this, this, what you would expect in a scenario like that. Well, if jobs are scarce as it is, then, we just need to be really deliberate about the systems we have in place, about who's going to get what kinds of jobs. So at this point, really, for the first several decades of the 20th century, a lot of folks will say, and I hear it almost weekly, but there for a bit almost daily, that was it. After about 1905, black people just did not work in the horse industry anymore. That is absolutely not true. And they worked in roles that are very much roles in the industry today that no one knows about and no one sees. All right, they're backside workers. They're working at tracks, they're exercise riders, they're grooms, they're hot walkers, they're working at farms, stallion managers, broodmare managers. A disproportionate amount of, if you're looking at overall farm employment in the bluegrass, there were more black workers represented in the farm workers of these horse farms than in terms of percentage than in the overall percentage. All right, so they're very much there. But whether they were white or black, we're not likely to know a lot about them because the historic record doesn't do a good job of telling stories of people like that, right? The everyday people, the workers, the backbone of any industry. It's not just unique to this industry. Pick an industry. Do we know about the daily grind of the steel workers in Pittsburgh? Are those the stories that are told? Those are stories that made headlines, in that period of time? No. In recent decades, are we striving to learn more? Yes. Well, this industry is the same, all right? We're trying to dig into the untold stories in general. Black horsemen and later black horsewomen being one. All right, what about backside workers? Period. All right, there would be no industry without these folks. Are there any questions for me? I'm taking way more time than I said I would. Okay, I just wanted to show you some lovely shots because, my goodness, look at this photo. I don't know the name of this young man, and I don't know that I ever will, but I know the horse who he was charged to care for, so that tells me something about this young man and his competence. Farriers. Only recently is systematically across Kentucky, we're starting to see more research and digging into the life, the evolution of the trade of being a farrier. This is Domino, by the way. You all heard of Domino? We had a cat at the library named Domino, after this Domino. Again, more grooms. Occasionally you might see a jockey valet. All right, a lot of folks think that this man was a clerk of scales when they see this photo. That's not what he would have been. He would have been Earl Sandy, who's this jockey here. He would have been his valet. That says so right on his cap. That would have been, at the time, being a valet would have been considered a very steady job. Not great paying, good paying. More grooms at farms and trackside, exercise riders. Occasionally, we don't hear stories about these folks who work behind the scenes, but occasionally their names do rise to occasional headlines. This being John Buckner on Man o' War. So John Buckner was the first stallion manager at the farm where Man o' War stood at stud. In the first 10 years Man o' War stood at stud, the farm had a woman as their manager, Elizabeth Dangerfield. All right, kind of unexpected that in the early 1920s you could place a horse like Man o' War anywhere, and you put him under a care of a woman at a farm down in Kentucky. And you should see the truck that they built to put Man o' War on when he paraded around that old Kentucky Association track when he came back here before he went to stand and stud at that farm. And I should have brought a shot of that. If you ever want to see it, just let me know and I'll email it to you. They basically just kind of took like a wagon and almost like put a trailer on top of it with a door, like an interior house door for access for people. But it was motorized, and it was like the very best of the best that they could piece together for this horse to have like a 15-mile drive down the road, and it was never used again. But John Buckner was Man o' War's groom and the stallion manager at the farm under Elizabeth Dangerfield for the first 10 years that Man o' War stood at stud. A lot of people don't remember John Buckner's story, although I don't know how, because Miss Dangerfield was really vocal about putting it out there. When she left the farm and started her own farm, Buckner went with her. Buckner had worked for her father before her. I think Will Harbit is probably who most people associate with Man o' War. So in this period of time, again, a lot of folks are working behind the scenes. We never see them. We never know about them. Unlike today where you can go visit a farm, people didn't just go hang out on farms. They were working operations. They weren't considered to be tourism or opportunities for fun or edutainment. They were working establishments. If you didn't live at the farm or know folks, you would have no way to know that there's this entire workforce out there. But sometimes folks like Will Harbit broke through, made headlines. Will Harbit really in many ways kind of pioneered the concept of a farm tour. And he started telling stories about Man o' War. And a year or two passes, people start to talk about Will Harbit's stories and his gift as a storyteller. And within 4 or 5 years after Will Harbit came to fulfill the role of stallion manager at the farm, 5,000 to 7,000 people started to show up at Faraway Farm to see Harbit talk about Man o' War. So much so that he was like, I gotta work. You gotta leave me alone. This is one horse. I have a whole barn full of horses I gotta take care of. I'm stallion manager here. But they did have a particularly tight bond, this pair. So do see a lot of coverage of folks like Will Harbit, but for every Will Harbit, there's thousands of stallion managers, broodmare managers. We don't know their names. Okay, I wanted to get us to the civil rights movement, and I chose this photo because I think it firmly places us there. The ability to get a license as a jockey and as a trainer, and the right to legally own a horse if you were black, for the first half of the 20th century was almost nil, okay? Like your possibility to do that. So what a lot of folks did to maintain their knowledge, to do what it is that they knew how to do, all that they knew how to do and all that they wanted to do, was they might go into partnership with a white man who would be willing to put their name on the paper as the owner of the horse. Well, a lot of those relationships went sour, but a lot of them worked. And then, they would be, it was sort of the situation where everybody knew they were the trainer, but your name was never going to appear as a trainer of record on a chart or in a program, like as an officially recognized entity before desegregation if you were black, man or woman. Somehow, and I don't know how, Sylvia Bishop just kind of was the exception to this rule. Not only was she the first African American woman to secure a license to train racehorses, she did it at a time where most black men could not, and her clientele list was very impressive. So she was training some of the best runners in the country, and this is Eddie Arcaro presenting her with a trophy here. One of the 20th century greats in terms of riders. Her client that day was Tyson Gilpin. But this is a founding member of Fasig-Tipton. And Sylvia Bishop is who Gilpin and many others like him, Guggenheim, others that you might not necessarily expect, chose this black woman from rural West Virginia to train their horses. Oscar Dishman was another gentleman who was here local. His daughter Marilyn lives in Lexington, has been very involved in our educational programs at the library. Oscar Dishman, for the first 10 to 15 years that he was working as a trainer and owning and breeding, he sometimes would record the ownership of the horse under his wife's name until it took a few years to find out that this woman was black. Then he'd go into partnership with a white man, and whatever it took to do what it is that he knew and what it was that he loved. But finally, after desegregation, he can operate where everybody else is operating at. All right, it's hard enough to make it in the business if you're training and you're owning and breeding. If you're in these small to medium-sized stables, let alone if you have all these obstacles in the way. Okay. So he goes on to have tremendous success, especially in the 70s. The late 70s, I think, were probably the most pronounced in terms of not only the number of races that he won as trainer and owner, and sometimes both, but the prestige and the winnings from those races. Cheryl White was the first black woman to get a license to ride in this country and win. When she had her first win, which was only her second ride, she won on a horse that was trained and owned by her father, who was black, and bred by her mother, who was white. At that time, when Cheryl was 17 and made the cover of Jet magazine in July of 71, about 3 weeks after that win, she was young. A lot of states didn't even recognize that, the marriage between her parents. But her mother was Polish and just an unbelievable mind and aptitude for pedigrees and breeding. Cheryl died a few years back. She rode horses for 20 years. She went out west and rode different breeds when she got a little too heavy to ride thoroughbreds. She also was a racing steward, and she died doing that work in the Midwest, which is where her family's from. But her brother last year wrote a children's book to chronicle her life called The Jockey and Her Horse. He co-wrote that book with Pulitzer nominee Sarah Maslanier, who writes for the New York Times. We have worked with those authors in a lot of children's literacy outreach programs and have donated 200 copies of that book to date to folks, and we just started in October. So we'll have ample opportunity to continue to get that book into classrooms and homes across the Bluegrass. And I hope at some point in the future here in this library. When a lot of people say, I've never seen a picture of a black jockey that wasn't in black and white. We have like hundreds of pictures like this. So this was taken in Evangeline Downs, 1978, and this was everyone that was in the job quarters at that time when they took that picture. This is Sylvester Carmouche. His father was a jockey, his grandfather was a jockey, his son is a jockey today. And when his father and grandfather were riding, for the most part, they were riding at bush tracks. So that was sort of Louisiana's answer to, you push us out, well, we'll just do it anyway. We'll just do it at that bush level. We never had that bush level here at Kentucky, but we just had, people entering in all these sort of interesting and clever business relationships just so they could legally own a racehorse and do what it is that they wanted to do. Marlin St. Julian, does this name ring a bell to anyone? This shot was taken at Keeneland. Marlin held meet titles in Louisiana, Texas, and Kentucky throughout the 90s. He won his first stakes race at Keeneland in '99. There's a shot from that race. But in 2000, when Marlin St. Julian had a mount in the Kentucky Derby, he was the first black jockey to have a mount in that race, which its whole first 30 years of its history was dominated by black horsemen. And in 2000, first black jockey since 1921 to have a mount in the Kentucky Derby. I told you that Sylvester from down in Louisiana, that Jock Quarters shot from Evangeline Downs, had a son that rides. This is his son, Kendrick. The last time I checked Kendrick's winnings, he was approaching $145 million in career earnings. And he's young and really just getting started. This is Deshaun Parker. Deshaun Parker actually is not young for a jockey. He is, breaking all kinds of odds for his age. He's in his early 50s. He started riding in the 80s as a 5'10", 5'11" young black man. Wow. I don't know how Deshaun did it, and I don't know how Deshaun does it. His father was the first African-American racing official at Midwestern Tracks, very esteemed man by the name of Darrell Parker. So racing was in Deshaun's life. He didn't set out to ride. He knew it was a hard life, but he wanted to play baseball, actually. But he very reluctantly got in the saddle, and once he did, he kind of never left. But despite his age, despite his height, last June, well, I guess I can't say last June anymore, June of 2022, Deshaun became one of only 20 jockeys of all time anywhere to surpass 6,000 career wins. And this is a shot of him in 2021 getting the George Wolfe Memorial Jockey Award. George Wolfe was one of Seabiscuit's riders, diabetic. Do you know that story? George Wolfe, this jockey award is the highest esteem you can receive if you're a rider in the industry. It's voted on by your peers. It's about your athleticism, but it's really more about your character and your role as an ambassador for the sport. So it's a tremendous honor. The year that Deshaun won, another finalist was Kendrick. Kendrick didn't win that year, but it's just a matter of time. And one last person that I want to focus on to bring us back full circle with very, very local roots is Greg Harbit. Greg Harbit is Will Harbit of Man o' War fame, stallion manager out of Faraway, his great-grandson. Greg's grandfather, Tom Harbit, trained horses before desegregation. And Greg's grandfather, Tom, was firmly in that era of, I'm training horses, everyone knows that it's me training that horse, everyone at the track, all the officials, all the fans, but my name is still not in that program. So that is the legacy that Greg comes from. Greg is a bloodstock agent. He and other co-owners brought Necker Island to the 2020 Kentucky Derby. And the 2020 Kentucky Derby was the pandemic. That's when it was not run in May. It was also a very tumultuous year of racial tension in this country, Louisville in particular, when the Derby was run. And Greg and Ray Daniels and other owners of that horse got a lot of pushback from the African American community about running a horse in that race. And their response was, we're going to run it. This is what generations of our family's been trying to get to, this goal, and we may never have a platform like this for the world to hear what our story is and what the stories were of the people that came before us doing this. So they did run that horse in that race. Greg and others formed the Ed Brown Society a few years ago, a nonprofit whose mission is to place young people of color in applied positions in the industry. So Keeneland hosted its first cohort of Ed Brown scholars last year. In fact, the library was privileged to host one of the Ed Brown Society Associates for 3 months, right after he finished his master's in history at UK before he moved to California to pursue his PhD. And Timothy Campbell is that young man's name, worked with me on some of the oral history videos that we did associated with this exhibit. So Greg Harbit and others are doing really good work and on that workforce development front, which is something that our industry so desperately needs. There are a lot of folks who want to work in the industry. Communications, track executive, broodmare managers, farm managers, never worked with horses, all right? And it seems like the jobs that the young folks gravitate toward in the industry aren't the applied boots on the grounds position. So, very quick, we're actually there. Like, this industry is in a labor shortage of people that know how to work with horses and are working in that backside capacity and in that management level, the management and caretaking of the horse level at the farms. Okay, you can't be a brood manager if you haven't gotten your hands dirty. All right, I had a student that came in the library and was telling me that he was getting his PhD in soil sciences, and I said, "Oh God, that's fascinating. How long have you farmed?" He said, "Oh, I've never farmed before." I thought, well, how are you going to design your research studies? But okay. But we get a lot of that in ag with young folks that come through. It's the desire to work in the publicity jobs, the management jobs, without that putting in the time to really know what it is that you're doing. So I'd share Greg and Ed Brown Society's story here at the end, just because it's a challenge that we're facing now. We don't have all the answers to it, but there are a lot of good folks at the table trying to come up with some solutions to draw young people into the industry, regardless of where they come from, regardless of what they look like at every role. And connecting the people who work with horses every day and have for 70 years. It's okay to work with a horse. You haven't arrived, you don't have to have arrived to have some sort of executive position. Okay, so this industry is experiencing some lags compared to others in the importance of the trades and those types of skills. So I don't think it's very shocking, really it's just kind of what you see in other ag industries as well. Everybody wants to research and lead. No one wants to do. So we need doers, okay? I have the back of the room. Oh, I just wanted to show you some pictures for some of our programs. We've been very lucky to have been funded on this effort, that we're able to send our exhibit out into the community at no cost to hosting institutions. We were able to offer just over 200 free educational programs to youth and adults last year, 21,000 people. This is just some highlights. At the back of the room, I have our exhibit companion book. So this is really the first chronicle of its time. It's really taken nearly 200 years of history with, biographical vignettes and highlights spanning that time, but also just kind of chronicling key moments in time, historically, economically, and politically, that shaped opportunities, and then the relationship between what's happening societally and the impacts that these lives are having on that culture, all right? So it's very much reciprocal. And I do have copies in the back. 90% of these books we printed to give to folks. 10% we printed to raise money for it. So I brought copies here for $10. Your $10 would support the Library Foundation, all right? It's from the foundation that we're able to offer all of this to folks for free. So 100% of the proceeds of that $10 goes to the foundation, okay? Because I was fortunate enough to have a financial backer to cover the entire cost of the book. A very rare position to be in, and one I'm very grateful for. Do you have any questions for me at all about the traveling exhibit, about some of the content? Yes?
You mentioned the house that overlooked the association track in eastern Lexington.
Yes.
How it had that observation area. Isaac Turner's house?
Isaac Murphy,
Isaac Murphy.
3rd and Nelson.
Is it open to the public?
It doesn't stand anymore. So that park, the Isaac Murphy Memorial Art Garden, sits on particularly that northeastern corner of it really just sits atop what would have been the foundation of that home. But there are some homes that these folks lived in that do still stand, like Ed Brown's house. Hello. Ed Brown lived, do you know where Martine's Bakery is in Lexington? What is it, 3rd and Eastern, I think? So right behind Martine's, there's an Italianate brick house with a bluegrass Trappist marker on it with some god-awful addition that somebody put on in the 80s. That's Ed Brown's house. We have 4 or 5 houses that are still standing in Lexington's East End that would have been not only the homes, but really the business, kind of hub for these racing and breeding stables. African Cemetery number 2, Yvonne Giles, who worked with me on this exhibit, is an understatement. I don't even really know how to put in words what it was that, basically I only said yes to doing this project if Mrs. Giles was on board. It wasn't going to happen without her. So she has spent decades and following decades of work by others that preceded her in African Cemetery number 2. It sits on 7th Street in Lexington's East End. And when she inherited that role, there were about 75 known black horsemen that had been identified in that cemetery. She now is approaching 200. And, each one of those is easily 50 hours worth of research. And that's a really straightforward one, okay? So it's a labor of love. We have her here. She's just a resource, an asset, a joy to work with. If there's anything that you ever want to know, she would be more than willing to talk with you. She's 78. So and she's busier than anyone I know. She has to say no to projects all the time. She's not slowing down. Mm-hmm.
2 questions. You gave some statistics about the number of black jockeys in early times. And do you have current ones now as far as Hispanic, the black, and Asian? And on the current jockey application, is there a place to check mark your race still?
Ethnicity as well, gender. Those would all be there as kind of, those types of, socioeconomic indicators on an application. I don't have exact percentages just because the industry is so fluid and people are coming in and out of all the time, but I can talk in terms of big trends. And that photo that we had of Jimmy Lee on his own, he was standing there all by himself in 1908. And I think that, a lot of those young men would have been 12 to 15 years old standing to the right of him. That would have been a good example of, for just a very brief moment, after all the black jockeys were pushed out of the saddle and Americans looked around and thought, oh, God, all our best talent is now gone. What do we do? There was about a 5-year period where there was intentional recruitment from England and Ireland of jockeys in particular. And a lot of those young men would have been a sample of that intentional recruitment effort. After that, migration and immigration trends just sort of took care of that void. With each successive wave of immigration, you had a fresh pool of talent to fulfill that role. So in the 10s and 20s, you see a lot of Irish names. The 20s and 30s and 40s, a lot of Italian American names. So Who's in the Saddle does mimic migration trends in this country, bringing us to today with a lot of Latina in the saddle. And by the way, with Cheryl White and all those pioneering women that broke through the gender barrier in you could not legally ride a racehorse if you were a woman in this country till 1968 was when the court case was settled. 1969 was when the first license was issued. Cheryl White was 14 when that happened, 17 when she was able to capture that record-breaking moment in 1971. So when that happened, there was just almost like it was just a very high percentage of women in the saddle. We have never seen that percentage of women in the saddle since the 70s. We have moments in time and it fluctuates, but that constant being on the road, making weight. It's just a challenge that hasn't shown to be a consistent career option for a lot of people. And there's a lot of oral histories from female riders talking about that and how that manifests in their lives.
Are you doing a composite of women in racing?
Maybe. Maybe our first bilingual exhibit too, but you didn't hear me say that because I have to get funding for it first.
I teach financial literacy at a high school in Lexington. I would love for you all to come out and tell our kids about the various careers in the horse industry. How
Yes.
do I get to make that happen?
You can just pick up my card and send me an email and we'll make it happen.
I got a weird one for you.
Yes.
And you don't have to speak volumes about it. You said that the black jockeys were getting more and more people violence on the track. But I know from the 30s, they were super scrappy anyway. I mean, jockeys were yanking at each other and doing stuff to how, I don't want to say how was it different, but
It was different because, it was different because, yes, there was definitely that scrappiness, but it wasn't one group pitted against another. It would just be kind of a smaller micro representation. But, you'd have a race where literally, if there were 4 white jockeys, it would have been planned with the owners, and it was just an intentional. Now, when you do that in a horse race, anything can happen. You could die, your horse could die. So you can imagine that a lot of the owners of these horses really weren't on board with this. And if they had an inclination to continue to contract with that black jockey, just to avoid the likelihood of another violent day at the track, they would shy away from it. So it was definitely a deterrent, and it seemingly a very intentional deterrent, because folks know what happens if you start fixing races in that way, in a very violent way. So it was just a way to force an outcome that you continue to contract these folks. Okay, well, we'll see how long that happens. If your horse's life is on the line, and you might think about it differently.
thank you.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming, and I do want to let you all know that our next lecture is March 9th, and it will be on Frankfort and Leestown, how the Taylor family influenced 2 pre-Kentucky settlements, and our speaker is the illustrious Richard Taylor in the back of the room. So thank you all for coming, and we'll see you next month.